There are a lot of ways to find out your neighbor doesn't respect boundaries. But coming home after a 3-week business trip and finding a 20-foot boat trailer parked squarely in the middle of your driveway is a pretty good one. The crazy part wasn't even that it was there. The crazy part was the look on my neighbor's face when I asked him to move it. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't apologetic. He wasn't even surprised that I had noticed. He looked at me the same way somebody looks at a hotel parking spot they've been using all weekend. Like it wasn't really mine to begin with. Looking back now, that's probably the moment this stopped being a parking issue and turned into something much bigger. My name's Ethan Carter, and at the time this happened I worked as a business consultant for regional manufacturing companies. That meant I traveled constantly. Some months I'd be home more than I was away. Other months I'd spend 3 weeks on the road and 4 days back. My neighborhood sat in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, the kind of place where people waved while mowing their lawns and complained about property taxes at backyard cookouts. Nothing dramatic ever happened there. At least that's what I thought. My driveway was unusually long, about 65 feet from the street to the garage. When I bought the property, one of the selling points was the extra parking space. I never imagined that feature would become the center of a neighborhood war. My next-door neighbor was a guy named Brandon Keller. Brandon owned a fishing boat that he treated like a member of the family. Every weekend he'd haul it somewhere, spend 2 days posting photos online, then come back talking about bass fishing like he'd just returned from a military deployment. Brandon wasn't a terrible guy on the surface. He was friendly enough when people were watching. But there was always something underneath, a quiet arrogance that made him think rules existed mainly for other people. About a year before everything exploded, he'd casually asked if he could leave his trailer in my driveway for a couple of days while relatives visited. I told him no, politely but clearly. I didn't want vehicles on my property when I wasn't home. He laughed and said he understood. I thought that was the end of it. Turns out it wasn't. Fast forward almost a year. I had just driven 6 hours back from a consulting project in Kentucky. I was exhausted. I wanted a shower, a hot meal, and maybe 12 straight hours of sleep. Instead, I turned onto my street and saw Brandon's boat trailer sitting right in the center of my driveway, like it paid property taxes there. At first I assumed there had to be some explanation. Maybe an emergency. Maybe somebody dropped it off temporarily. Maybe Brandon planned to move it later that afternoon. So I walked next door and knocked. He opened the door holding a beer. I pointed toward the driveway and said, "Hey Brandon, your trailer is blocking my property." He looked past me toward the driveway and shrugged. Actually shrugged. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You're gone all the time anyway. Figured you weren't using it." Just like that. No apology. No request. No acknowledgement that he was standing there admitting he'd been using somebody else's property without permission. Before I could even respond, he turned around and walked back into his house. Conversation over. Door shut. I stood there for a few seconds wondering if that had really happened. The thing about disrespect isn't always the action itself. Sometimes it's the certainty behind it. Brandon wasn't acting like a guy who got caught. He was acting like a guy who genuinely believed he had a right to what belonged to somebody else. That night, I couldn't let it go. I opened my security camera system and started reviewing archived footage. Originally, I was just trying to determine how long the trailer had been there. Maybe a few weeks. Maybe a month. What I found instead made my stomach tighten. The trailer kept appearing over and over. Different dates. Different weeks. Different seasons. Spring. Summer. Fall. Nearly every week. The deeper I looked, the worse it got. There were recordings showing Brandon and his friends loading coolers, tackle boxes, fuel containers, and camping equipment directly from my driveway. There were weekends when the trailer sat there for days. On one recording, a group of his buddies were standing on my property drinking beer while preparing for a fishing trip. Nobody asked permission. Nobody even looked concerned about being there. Why would they? Brandon had apparently spent months presenting my property as an extension of his own. Around midnight, I finally stopped reviewing footage and leaned back in my chair. What started as irritation had turned into something else entirely. Because now I knew this wasn't a one-time incident. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was 11 months of deliberate behavior built on one simple assumption that because I wasn't around to see it, I would never know it was happening. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to threaten. I wasn't going to stand in the street yelling like some reality TV neighbor dispute. If Brandon wanted to turn my driveway into his personal parking lot, I was going to make sure it became the most expensive parking spot in the entire neighborhood. Before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of people make a mistake. Most folks hear a story like this and immediately think, just call the police. The problem is that property disputes usually aren't that simple. According to standard procedure, law enforcement often treats situations like this as civil matters unless there's clear criminal activity involved. That means the burden usually falls on the property owner to document everything, establish ownership, and create a paper trail. From a legal perspective, the strongest position is rarely the loudest one, it's the best documented one. And honestly, that's where a lot of entitled people get trapped. This is a psychological trap that shows up all the time. Someone gets away with a small violation once, then twice, then 10 times, and eventually they stop thinking of it as your property and start thinking of it as their right. The longer nobody challenges the behavior, the more justified they feel. The lesson here is that boundaries don't disappear because you're absent. But if you don't enforce them, some people will convince themselves they never existed in the first place. The next morning I called a real estate attorney instead of Brandon. That detail matters because by then I wasn't interested in winning an argument. I was interested in building a case. Her name was Melissa Grant, and after listening to my explanation, she asked a question nobody else had asked yet. Do you have evidence? I almost laughed. I had 11 months of evidence. Security footage, timestamps, archived recordings, and enough digital proof to create a documentary series. 2 days later, she reviewed my property deed, county survey records, easement maps, and every document connected to the lot. The answer came back crystal clear. Every inch of that driveway belonged exclusively to me. No shared access agreement. No utility easement. No special neighborhood exception. Nothing. Then she explained something interesting. Because Brandon's use had been ongoing and clearly unauthorized, I had options. Not magical movie options where somebody gets arrested on the spot, but real-world options backed by documentation and contracts. That's when the idea started forming. If Brandon wanted to use my driveway so badly, maybe it was time he became a paying customer. That weekend I got to work. The first thing I installed was a heavy-duty steel bollard near the entrance of the driveway. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't symbolic. It was the kind of thing you notice immediately if you're towing a trailer and hoping to pull onto private property. It operated with a combination lock and could block access completely. Next came professionally printed signs. Private property. Unauthorized vehicles subject to towing at owner's expense. I made sure they were impossible to miss. Then came the certified letter. That was my favorite part. Melissa helped draft it, and every sentence was carefully written. No emotional language. No insults. No threats. Just facts. The letter outlined documented unauthorized use of the property over an 11-month period. It referenced available video evidence. It established ownership. Then it presented 2 options. Option 1. Permanently remove the trailer and never park any vehicle on my property again. Option 2. Enter into a formal rental agreement at $195 per month and provide retroactive compensation totaling $2,145 for the previous 11 months of unauthorized use. The letter concluded with a 72-hour response deadline. I mailed it and waited. Brandon's reaction arrived faster than expected. 24 hours later, he was pounding on my front door. Not knocking. Pounding. I opened the door and found him red-faced and furious. He waved the letter in the air like it had personally offended him. You can't be serious, he snapped. You're charging me for parking in an empty driveway. I said, no, Brandon. I'm charging you for parking in my driveway. His jaw tightened. Nobody does this. Actually, I replied, property owners do it all the time. He launched into a speech about neighbors helping neighbors. Community spirit. Being reasonable. The irony was almost impressive. A man who had ignored my ownership rights for nearly a year was suddenly giving lectures about cooperation. When he realized I wasn't backing down, he switched tactics. You're being greedy. I smiled. Then stop using it. That ended conversation number 1. Conversation number 2 happened 3 days later. This time he tried a friendlier approach. He showed up carrying a 6-pack and acting like we were old buddies having a misunderstanding. He talked about fishing trips, property values, neighborhood relationships, everything except the actual issue. Eventually he offered me $300 to forget the whole thing. I declined. Then he offered $500. I declined again. The real problem wasn't the money anymore. The real problem was that Brandon still believed this was a negotiation between equals. It wasn't. He had spent 11 months violating boundaries and now wanted a discount on accountability. Over the following weeks, he called me unreasonable to anyone willing to listen. Apparently, I became the villain of the neighborhood, at least according to Brandon. The funny part was that the more he complained, the more people started sharing information. One afternoon, an older couple from across the street stopped me while I was checking the mail. The husband asked, "Is this about Brandon's trailer?" I said yes. He laughed and said, "That thing's been sitting in your driveway forever." A few days later, another neighbor mentioned seeing Brandon's fishing buddies gathering there almost every weekend. Then a third neighbor confirmed nearly the same timeline I had documented through the cameras. Suddenly, Brandon's version of events began collapsing. His story had always depended on ambiguity. Maybe it was only a few times. Maybe there had been permission. Maybe nobody knew exactly how long it lasted. Once witnesses entered the picture, all of that disappeared. What remained was a very simple reality. He had used someone else's property for nearly a year because he assumed there would never be consequences. About a month after the certified letter, I received a message from Brandon demanding mediation. He still thought there was some magical compromise waiting to be discovered. During the meeting, he spent nearly an hour explaining why my driveway wasn't really costing me anything while he used it. I listened quietly before asking one question. "If your driveway has no value, can I start parking there tomorrow?" The room went silent. He knew exactly what I was proving. Value isn't determined by usage. Ownership creates value. Access creates value. Control creates value. That's why people buy property in the first place. After mediation failed, things got very quiet. Weeks passed, then months. The trailer disappeared from my driveway entirely. The bollard remained locked. The signs remained visible. Every now and then I'd catch Brandon looking toward my property with the same expression people have when they realize a shortcut no longer exists. Around day 70, there was another knock on my door. This time it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't angry. When I opened the door, Brandon stood there holding an envelope. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. The confidence was gone. The entitlement was gone. Even the posture looked different. He handed me the envelope and said, "I want to settle this." Inside was a signed copy of the rental agreement and a check for $2,145. Just like that. 11 months of assumptions had finally collided with reality. I signed my portion of the agreement, shook his hand, and watched him walk away. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but there was one detail Brandon hated more than the money. The contract contained a clause specifically addressing missed payments. If a monthly payment was late, even once, access would immediately terminate. The bollard would remain locked. A towing company could be dispatched within 24 hours if unauthorized parking occurred. Any resulting costs would belong entirely to him. Brandon asked me to remove that clause. Twice. I refused both times. Trust is a funny thing. It takes years to build and seconds to destroy. By the time we signed that agreement, trust wasn't part of the equation anymore. Documentation was. Structure was. Accountability was. Today the arrangement still exists. Every month Brandon pays for the same space he once treated as free. Every month he receives a reminder that assumptions can become expensive. And every time I see that payment arrive, I think back to the afternoon he stood in my driveway and told me I didn't need it because I traveled too much. What he failed to understand was that absence doesn't transfer ownership. It doesn't create permission. It doesn't erase boundaries. It simply reveals who respects them and who doesn't. In the end, the most satisfying part wasn't the check, the contract, or even the victory. It was watching someone learn that confidence and entitlement are not the same thing. One is earned. The other usually comes with a bill attached. Brandon just happened to receive his 11 months later. After everything was over, after the letters, the meetings, the arguments, the witnesses, the check, and the contract, I found myself thinking about something that had very little to do with the driveway. On the surface, this story sounds like it's about a boat trailer and a stubborn neighbor, but honestly, that was never the real issue. The real issue was boundaries. Not fences, not property lines. Human boundaries. The invisible agreements that allow people to live next to each other without constantly ending up in conflict. Most of us understand those boundaries instinctively. We know not to walk into someone else's backyard without permission. We know not to borrow someone's tools and keep them for a year. We know not to treat another person's property like a public resource. Yet every now and then you meet someone who operates under a completely different set of assumptions. They start with a small justification. Maybe nobody is using it. Maybe they won't notice. Maybe it isn't hurting anyone. Then that justification grows over time until it becomes something that feels like a right. This is a psychological trap that catches more people than you might think. The human brain is remarkably good at turning repeated behavior into perceived entitlement. If somebody gets away with crossing a line long enough, they stop seeing the line altogether. Brandon didn't wake up one morning and decide to become the villain in a neighborhood dispute. At least I don't think he did. What happened was probably much simpler. He parked there once. Nothing happened. Then again. Nothing happened. Then a few more times. Eventually his brain rewrote the situation. In his mind, my driveway stopped being my driveway and became available space. That's why he looked genuinely shocked when I pushed back. From his perspective, I wasn't defending my property. I was disrupting an arrangement he had quietly created for himself. From a legal perspective, that's one of the reasons documentation matters so much. Feelings change. Memories change. Stories change. Records don't. According to standard procedure, property disputes are often won long before anyone steps into a courtroom because the person with the best documentation usually has the strongest position. That's not exciting. It's not dramatic. But it's true. The camera footage didn't get angry. The survey map didn't exaggerate. The deed didn't care who was more likable. Facts simply sat there waiting to be reviewed. And when everything was examined objectively, the answer became obvious. The lesson here is that protecting your boundaries doesn't make you selfish. That's something a lot of people struggle with, especially those of us who were raised to avoid conflict. We worry about being seen as difficult. We worry about upsetting neighbors, friends, co-workers, even family members. So we stay quiet longer than we should. Unfortunately, silence is often interpreted as permission by the very people who are causing the problem. One thing I've learned is that respectful people usually respond well to reasonable boundaries. Entitled people tend to respond with outrage. The reaction often tells you everything you need to know. Looking back, if Brandon had simply knocked on my door from the beginning and asked for help, this entire situation probably would have ended differently. We could have worked something out. Maybe not for free, but certainly without months of conflict. Instead, he made a choice based on assumption, and assumptions are expensive teachers. In a strange way, I think both of us learned something. I learned that being absent doesn't mean being unaware. He learned that ownership still matters even when nobody appears to be watching. And maybe the neighborhood learned something too. These days nobody parks anything on my property without asking first. Funny how that works. So now I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever had a neighbor, an HOA board member, a contractor, or even a family member start treating your property like it belonged to them? Did you confront it immediately, or did it build up over time the way this situation did? Let me know down in the comments because stories like these always spark interesting debates. Some people think I should have let it go. Others think I should have charged him even more. Personally, I think the outcome was fair. He paid for what he used, he signed an agreement, and everybody walked away with a better understanding of where the boundaries actually were. And honestly, that's probably the closest thing to justice most neighborhood disputes ever get.